The Dresdner, an Aelithian observation vessel, hovered in high orbit over Vernex 6, a frozen wasteland of jagged ice and deep fissures. A planetary mining operation had been established decades prior, extracting valuable minerals from beneath its frigid surface, but the constant risk of seismic activity made every excavation a gamble. Today, the gamble had failed. A massive subterranean collapse had trapped 14 workers inside Tunnel Epsilon 47 Trellin, 6 humans, and 1 Orcivic. The structural integrity of the tunnel was unknown, and time was running out. The temperature was dropping, oxygen levels would soon become a concern, and additional cave-ins were likely. Rescue operations were already considered difficult at best and impossible at worst. The Aelithians, meticulous and methodical, saw an opportunity in the unfolding disaster. Commander Seville, his forearms folded across his chest, observed the frozen planet through the viewport of the Dresdner. Like most of his species, he believed in the value of measured endurance, in strategic exertion rather than brute persistence. Humans, according to every data analysis he had reviewed, were not built for long-duration rescue efforts. They burn out quickly, he had once told his second-in-command, Yevon. They are capable of sudden bursts of strength, but they require sleep cycles that are too rigid, caloric intake that is too frequent, and hydration levels that are difficult to maintain. This operation would confirm that. The Aelithians had been sent to assess whether humans could function as reliable emergency responders within the Galactic Cooperative. If they fatigued too quickly, if they failed, then the Cooperative would look elsewhere. As the human rescue ship Solace entered Vernex 6's orbit, Seville and Yevon observed with the same analytical detachment they always maintained. The ship touched down, its ramp lowering to reveal a team of 12 humans moving with practiced urgency. They carried an assortment of heavy equipment, plasma cutters, reinforced support beams, and seismic scanners, barely acknowledging the presence of the Aelithian observers. At the center of it all was their leader, Ethan Calder. He was unremarkable in size and shape, but his presence was undeniable. He moved with a practiced confidence, issuing orders with quick efficiency. His team followed his lead without hesitation, spreading out to assess the unstable tunnel. Seville had observed humans long enough to understand their baseline endurance levels. By his calculations, Calder and his team had 4 hours of high-performance work in them before signs of exhaustion set in. 6 hours, and they would begin making mistakes. 8 hours, and they would be ineffective. This mission would likely exceed those limits. Seville and Yevon followed the humans from a short distance, their thermal suits adjusting to the harsh climate. They would observe, document, and record the exact moment the humans faltered. The humans moved fast, setting up scanners to locate the trapped workers. They worked in near silence, only speaking when necessary, their focus absolute. Calder barely stopped moving. He examined the ice, checked the stability of the collapsed tunnel, and gave orders as if he had already calculated every possible scenario in his head. Seville was unimpressed. Speed was not endurance. The first cut into the ice was made, and the excavation began. At first, everything went smoothly. The thermal drills carved through the frozen layers with precision, the support beams were placed strategically, and the work followed a controlled rhythm. But then, without warning, the ice shifted. A secondary collapse. The rescue team barely had time to react before another section of the tunnel caved in, forcing them to halt all progress. For a moment, the only sound was the howling wind. Seville expected hesitation, frustration, perhaps even retreat. Calder did none of those things. "No one stops," he called, his voice sharp. "We go around. New entry point. Move." There was no debate. The team immediately adjusted their approach, shifting their equipment, recalibrating their scanners, and digging from a different angle. Seville frowned. That was unusual. Most species, when faced with failure, paused. They reassessed, re-strategized, or at the very least took a moment to recover. The humans did not. Their response was immediate adaptation. Seville kept watching. The work was grueling. Every movement required effort, every cut through the ice was deliberate. The humans' bodies were visibly strained, they were sweating despite the cold, their breath forming thick clouds of vapor. The Trellin, a species known for their controlled exertion and calculated rest cycles, had begun showing signs of fatigue. Two of them collapsed from exhaustion, forced to withdraw to safety. Seville turned his attention back to Calder, expecting the same. Instead, the human took the place of one of the fallen Trellin without hesitation. He grabbed a thermal drill and kept going. He should conserve his strength, even murmured. Seville agreed. The human's movements had become less fluid, his breathing heavier. Every logical analysis suggested that pushing himself further was a mistake. But Calder didn't stop. Neither did his team. Another shift in the ice sent a tremor through the ground, a warning of another possible collapse. One of the human responders stumbled, nearly crushed under a falling slab of ice. He barely escaped, took a moment to steady himself, and then went back to work. Seville could not comprehend it. Commander even said, "Quieter now. They are still working." Seville said nothing. Hours passed. The wind grew harsher. The cold became unbearable. The humans were slowing now, their movements heavier, their bodies shaking from exertion. One of them collapsed outright, unable to continue. Another took their place. The rhythm never stopped. Seville's assumptions were breaking. The humans were not tireless. He could see their pain, their exhaustion, the way their bodies were screaming for rest. But they kept failing forward. Each time one of them hit their limit, another stepped in. Each time the work became unbearable, someone bore it anyway. And then, at long last, the ice gave way. A hollow pocket. Weak voices carried up through the opening. The trapped workers were alive. The humans did not cheer, did not pause to celebrate. They simply kept working, pulling the survivors out, stabilizing the injured, wrapping them in thermal blankets. Seville watched as Calder, covered in frost and bleeding from a gash on his arm, lifted a Trellin worker onto a stretcher. His hands trembled from exertion, his face was pale from the cold, but he did not stop moving. Seville exhaled slowly. They should have stopped, even whispered. Seville didn't look away. They should have. But they hadn't. The rescued workers were alive, but the operation was far from over. The tunnel was still unstable. Ice continued to shift overhead, groaning under its own weight. The Trellin and Orcivic survivors were disoriented, suffering from cold exposure and oxygen deprivation. Some were injured, unable to walk without assistance. The humans had worked tirelessly to reach them, but now they faced a new challenge, getting everyone out before the tunnel collapsed again. Ethan Calder barely took a breath before shifting his focus. "We move now," he ordered. "Medics, check vitals on the injured. If they can walk, they walk. If they can't, we carry them." His team sprang into action, their exhaustion evident but irrelevant. One responder, a woman named Hale, immediately started scanning the survivors for hypoxia, injecting a Trellin worker with an oxygen booster before slinging his arm over her shoulder. Another, Roderick, took a stabilization harness from his pack and secured it around the injured Orcivic's torso. Seville had expected a moment of recovery. A pause, at the very least. But the humans seemed to function on a different logic. There was no pause, only motion. His analytical mind struggled to make sense of it. "They are still at the limits of their endurance," even noted. He sounded uncertain, as if the words did not match the reality in front of him. "Yes," Seville said, watching Calder as the human hauled another survivor to his feet. "And yet they continue." The extraction was brutal. The ice beneath them had been weakened by their excavation efforts, making each step treacherous. Any shift in weight could send a responder plummeting into an unseen crevasse. The air was thinner this deep underground, forcing their bodies to work even harder. Calder moved between his team and the survivors, checking their conditions, making sure no one lagged behind. The rescued Trellin, though hardy, were struggling. Their species had efficient metabolic cycles, but those cycles relied on scheduled periods of rest. The stress of being trapped, followed by the sudden exertion of evacuation, had pushed them beyond their limits. Two more collapsed before they had even reached the halfway point. Seville watched, expecting Calder to finally slow. Instead, the human gestured to one of his responders. "We need stretchers here. Get them secured." Roderick hesitated. "We're already carrying." Figure it out, Calder cut in. We don't leave anyone behind. Roderick didn't argue. Two responders shifted their load, adjusting their packs to redistribute weight. They lifted the unconscious Trellin onto makeshift stretchers, their muscles visibly straining under the effort. Seville turned to Yevon. They are overloading themselves. It is illogical, Yevon agreed. And yet the humans did not stop. The exit loomed ahead, an incline leading back to the surface. It should have been a relief, but Seville could already see the problem. The path had been widened by the excavation efforts, but not enough for an easy ascent. The survivors were weak, and the responders were already carrying too much. Another species might have decided to leave the injured behind, promising to return for them once the others were safe. Aelithians would have reassessed, determined the most practical solution. Calder just adjusted his grip and started climbing. One of the Trellin, still groggy, nearly collapsed halfway up. Calder grabbed him, half dragging, half carrying the alien up the incline. His breath was coming in sharp bursts now. His hands trembled from exertion. Still, he did not stop. Roderick and Hale followed his example, each carrying far more than they should have been able to. Another human, Voss, stumbled on the ice and nearly lost his footing. Instead of retreating, instead of reassessing, Calder grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. Seville felt something unfamiliar then. A shift deep within his core. He was impressed. By the time the last survivor was brought to the surface, the humans looked broken. They were covered in frost and sweat, their bodies visibly shaking. Their movements had slowed, their faces pale with exhaustion. And yet they had done it. All 14 trapped workers were alive. Seville had no words. Yevon, standing beside him, was equally silent. The other Aelithians had long since stopped taking notes. The mission was over. The results were undeniable. Seville turned back toward Calder, who was still standing, barely, his hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. He looked like a man who had pushed himself beyond every limit imaginable. Then, with a quiet exhale, he straightened up. "All right," Calder said, "we need medical scans on everyone. Get the stretchers stabilized. I don't want anyone going into shock after all that." Seville's disbelief deepened. The rescue was over. The work was done. And yet Calder was still thinking about others. It was not instinct. It was not biology. It was choice. Seville understood then why humans were different. Why they had survived on their unstable homeworld. Why they had thrived in environments that should have killed them. It was not because they were the strongest. It was not because they were the fastest. It was because, when given the option to stop, they never did. The storm rolled in just as the last of the injured were being loaded onto the Solace. The wind howled across the ice plains, thick flurries of snow obscuring the landscape in a near whiteout. Visibility dropped. The temperature plummeted. Vernex 6's atmosphere was volatile, and the rescue had already pushed the limits of what the planet would tolerate. Ethan Calder wiped a layer of frost from his visor and turned toward his team. No one had collapsed yet, but they were close. Roderick was hunched over, hands on his knees, his shoulders rising and falling with every breath. Hale's face was red with cold exposure, and Voss's arms were shaking as he secured the last of the medical supplies. The others weren't much better. Half of them had exceeded what should have been their physical limits hours ago. They needed rest. They weren't going to get it. A sudden alarm blared from one of the Trellin medics inside the Solace. "Cardiac event detected," the Trellin announced, her voice clipped and urgent. "Or civic worker is going into shock." Calder didn't even blink before moving. He reached the ship in seconds, hauling himself up the ramp as the Trellin medic adjusted the biostabilizers around the Orcivic's chest. The alien's body was struggling to regulate itself. Prolonged exposure to the cold had caused a thermal imbalance, a condition Orcivic physiology was notoriously bad at correcting on its own. Seville and Yevon had followed, their observation now a full immersion in the aftermath of the rescue. Calder didn't hesitate. "How long do we have?" "Minutes," the medic said, adjusting the scanner. "We need to elevate his body temperature, but his system is rejecting external heat regulation." Calder cursed under his breath. He knew what that meant. If external heat wasn't an option, they needed internal metabolic activation, and there was only one way to trigger that fast enough. "We need him conscious," Calder said. "That could worsen the shock." "He's already dying," Calder snapped, shaking the Orsivic's shoulder. "Come on, big guy. Wake up. I need you awake." The alien groaned weakly, but his eyes didn't open. Seville watched in absolute silence. Humans were beyond exhausted. Their mission was complete. And yet, they were still pushing themselves forward. Calder glanced around, then grabbed a vial from the emergency medical kit, a stimulant normally used for reviving unconscious responders in high-altitude rescue situations. He had no idea if it would work on Orcivic biology, but he was out of options. He injected it straight into the Orsivic's arm. Nothing happened at first. Then, a sharp inhale. The alien's eyes fluttered open, his breathing erratic but present. "That's it," Calder said, his voice softer now. "Stay awake. Stay with me." The Orcivic let out a shuddering exhale, his body beginning to regulate itself. The crisis wasn't over, but they had bought time. Seville had seen enough. He turned to Yevon. "The assessment is complete." Yevon nodded slowly. "There is no doubt." The storm worsened, forcing everyone to remain inside the solace for the next several hours. The humans, despite everything, still refused to rest. They moved between the injured, adjusting medical packs, distributing thermal blankets, checking oxygen levels. Even Calder, whose hands were visibly shaking from exhaustion, continued working. Seville finally stepped forward. "You must stop." Calder didn't look up. "Not an option." "You misunderstand. The danger has passed. The mission is complete. There is no longer a reason to continue pushing yourself." Calder did look up then, and for the first time since the operation had begun, his exhaustion was visible in his eyes. "There's always a reason," he said. Seville studied him carefully. Humans were not designed for endurance. Their bodies lacked the self-regulation of Trellin. They needed more sustenance than Orcivic. They did not possess the biochemical efficiency of Aelithians. And yet, when every other species would have collapsed, humans simply refused to stop moving. Seville exhaled slowly. "I was wrong about you." Calder let out a tired chuckle. "Yeah, I get that a lot." The storm finally began to ease, the wind settling into a low howl over the frozen landscape. The ice groaned beneath the weight of shifting pressure fronts, but the worst had passed. Inside the solace, warmth had returned, but exhaustion hung in the air like a heavy fog. The rescued miners were stable, their vitals improving. The human responders, however, looked broken. Their bodies had finally begun demanding what they had been denied for the last 12 hours: rest, food, warmth, sleep. Ethan Calder sat on a supply crate, elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped together. His uniform was still dusted with ice and rock, the fabric torn in places. He had finally stopped moving. Seville stepped closer, studying him. The other humans had slumped against bulkheads, some half asleep where they sat. Calder, though clearly drained, still had an alertness to him, an instinct that refused to let him fully relax. "You should rest," Seville said. Calder exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Not yet." Seville didn't understand. "There is no danger now. You have succeeded. There is nothing more to do." Calder lifted his head slightly, his tired gaze locking onto Seville's. "There's always something more to do." The words were simple, but Seville recognized the weight behind them. This wasn't just about this mission. This was who they were. Humans didn't stop because their work was never truly finished. There was always another problem to solve, another crisis to avert, another person to help. Even when their bodies demanded rest, their minds refused to yield. The Aelithians had built their endurance around efficiency, resting strategically, preserving strength, ensuring long-term viability. Humans, on the other hand, seemed to embrace exhaustion as part of existence. They functioned on the edge of collapse, and yet, somehow they endured anyway. Seville had studied humans for months, trying to quantify their capabilities. He had never accounted for this. "You cannot function like this indefinitely," Seville said after a moment. Calder smirked tiredly. "We manage." A silence stretched between them. Around them, the solace was finally settling. The rescued miners were receiving final medical scans. The human responders were starting to succumb to their exhaustion, one by one. Hale had fallen asleep with a half-eaten ration bar in her hand. Roderick was slumped against a med crate, his head tilted at an awkward angle. Only Calder was still upright. Seville exhaled slowly. "You have proven your point." Calder raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know I was making one." "We were. And we were wrong." Seville turned to Yevon, who had been silently observing the exchange. "Humans are not like other species. Their endurance is not biological, it is mental. They push past their limits, not because they can, but because they refuse not to." Yevon nodded. "It is. Unsettling." Seville glanced back at Calder, watching as the human finally leaned back against the cold bulkhead. His eyes were heavy, but he was still fighting sleep. Seville had spent his entire career studying endurance, analyzing the limits of different species, cataloging their weaknesses and strengths. Yet nothing in the galaxy made sense of what he had witnessed today. Finally, Calder exhaled and closed his eyes. Not because he wanted to, but because for the first time in 12 hours he allowed himself to.